My name is Asbjørn Skou, and I'm a visual artist from Copenhagen in Denmark, and I am exhibiting here at the Drawing Centre in Diepenheim with the exhibition Becoming Numerous. The exhibition itself is a way of using drawing to engage with narrative structures and try to let them unfold within the Arts Centre as a spacious way of thinking narrative. The exhibition started out from a much more, you'd say, like maybe rigorous or academic network of discourse, where I think that, as with any narrative, it became more organic during the process of it and more intuitive, and has in a lot of ways been about trying to go into a field of fictioning that deals with critical thought and unfold that within the art space. I was invited by the Drawing Centre to create a series of very large wall drawings based on that is a big part of my praxis. And one of the ways that I engage with these wall drawings is to try to unfold serial narrative fictions within space, much in the same way that you would do within, for example, a publication, let's say a graphic novel in a sense, that you have images that correspond to other images that then form a storyline of a certain kind. And then when translating that into a physical space, it translates into that I have made these very large graphite drawings that sort of encompasses the entire drawing center. And on top of these are placed smaller graphite drawings on paper that corresponds back into sort of the landscape of the wall drawings. And that has been the formal concept of the work, is to sort of to engage with the space in two different ways of using drawings as a mapping of fiction. Engaging in this type of storytelling that I use drawing to transmit, I usually start out with what I at least myself think of as a more or less rigorous framework for something, that I have this idea and say, okay, within this idea, this story will take place. That can be like a concept or situation or a circumstance somehow that you're unfolding and retelling or morphing through the drawing and the narrative that the drawings transmit. And in this particular exhibition, I have been going back and forth a little bit because I had an initial starting point which sort of dissolved between my hands, and that's somehow what happens once in a while when you're in this process of making things, that you start out having a very clear intention and the things start developing on their own. And I think it does so with particularly with working with something that has like a story feel to it. And of course, when I mention story feel now, most people are going to think of a classical narrative that is like a progressive story where we have a protagonist and a certain coding to how we understand story, beginning and end and middle and point of no return and these structures. And just to be very clear, that's not what we're working in here. This is an art space, so like art functions in a different way than other types of narratives. And in this sense, I'm making more like a fragmented journey through a certain landscape. This landscape has like a conceptual perimeter of a certain sense, in that both that all the drawings functions as notes on things that are taking place elsewhere. All the drawings have a basis in stories that are elsewhere, but are being coupled together as a type of, let's say like, a map or a network of stories that interact upon each other. I have had these two concepts that I continuously return to as guidelines in the work, which is the concept of crisis and the concept of kairos. And crisis is, of course, like a pinnacle of trouble in a certain sense, like where you reach a point of calamity, is connected to this idea of calamity. That can be an external crisis or an internal crisis in different ways. We know it from ecological crisis, or financial crisis, psychological crisis, a crisis of marriage. That could also be like crisis in that sense translates very well. I think most people will relate to that. Like, we all know crisis in one scale or another. Kairos, on the other hand, is maybe a little bit less known concepts. Both derive from the same word in Greek, which actually stems back to the form of critique. And kairos is, in the same way that crisis is, in Greek mythology, a deity. Like most Greek concepts are both a deity and a concept at the same time. Kairos is described as the opportune moment for change, and therefore also interconnected with crisis always, because as much as crisis is this point of no return, when something acutely dissolves, that is also the moment where you can step in and say, now we can do something different. And I think etymologically that lends itself interestingly back to this idea of critique, of saying, okay, the critical point is when we can see something alter itself and change from a static form into a more fluid form. The title functions as a perimeter of reference both to 3 different pieces of literature, but also to, you could say, that concept of something dissolving from a static singularity to a plural multiplicity, in the sense of branching out. That concretely what I've been doing is that I take these images and these stories that are represented within the images from different sources, be that newspapers or archival material, and like different types of structures that already has a meaning and a sense in the world. And then I dissolve them and take them out of their context. The moment that I then translate them into the white cube of the art space, the white cube in that sense become a black box. We know what goes in the box, we do not know what comes out the box necessarily. And in that sense, the idea of becoming numerous is something that you are translating a singularity into a multiplicity, and the multiplicity carrying this idea of something that branches out in multiple directions, but is like at the same time a unit, a monad, so to speak. The images that you see when entering the exhibition all comes from contemporary sources of information, but they get this like out of time feel in a certain sense, that the way both that they manifest and coupled, that you have like certain archaic figures that merge with contemporary circumstances, that you have like contemporary factory settings of car factories merging with like classical Greek statues that has been morphing into dogs' heads, that you have police horses merging in with like pagan deities, that you have different these types of entities, you would say, that act in the world within this certain frame of fiction, of course. And it's in this sense, it's a way of trying to take the real and let it undergo a change in a process that I would call like fictioning, that it's not just forming a fiction, because it's not a classical fiction in that sense that we would find in a classical movie or a novel, but it's a fictioning when you're constantly like trying to merge things, and of course within the language of drawings. If we were making a movie, we'd be drawing on different theory of how fiction works within movies. And if we're making a graphic novel, that would have its own sort of rules of engagement. And of course, I borrow from these various structures. For example, like a collage theory that is borrowed from traditional Russian collage filmmaking, where you say 1 + 1 does not equal 2, it equals 3 or more. In the sense, graphic novels in the way that you have like sets of images connected to each other that you will automatically say this does shape a narrative, even though that there are no text necessarily. And these things are, of course, things that I borrow from other systems, but at the same time, we're not in a movie, we're not in a graphic novel, we're in an art center. So we're in a physical space where we move around, drawings that inform us about certain conditions or tell certain like situations to us. And that we have to sort of, as observers within this field, we have to find a way through this landscape, or this map of different landscapes that overlap and intermingle. Drawing is, I would say, like the central aspect in my art praxis or artwork as a whole, but it's applied in very different ways. So in a lot of ways, I think of drawing as a tool to convey a certain signal. That in a sense, it is, as much as it's also always about like trying to figure out what drawing is to me personally, drawing has always for me been a way of transmitting things, like a language where you tell something in. And in that sense, drawing is also for me very connected to shorthand, for example, the way that your handwriting is. It's this most intermediate way of translating something that goes on inside your world to an outer world in that sense. One of the things that also has been central to me for a lot of years has been with trying to work with what you'd say like most basic means, then this entire exhibition is done basically with a pencil, which is a tool that we all have a relation to. We all know the weight of a pencil. We know how it smells, how it feels in the hand. And in that sense, I'm taking something that is very common denominator for all of us, saying, okay, we can relate to this tool. And then I'm trying to push it, of course, and saying like, what happens when the pencil drawing is suddenly X amount of square meters big? What happens when we push that like field of how we work with this tool within it? Again, it's also an exhibition without any color, because we're just basically working with the valeur that the pencil has, like what is the depth and weight of the graphite in it. And that thing about like having very basic means to try to tell a complex story is something that I think have been very central in my practice, in ways of using drawing as a very basic means to engage with various types of different spaces, from like public spaces to institutional spaces to the space of books to working within a digital sphere, but constantly being able to use drawing as the thing where I translate other concepts. So it's kind of an approach to investigating the world and trying to create this monodialogue with an audience of where I'm putting something out to let other people engage in my way of engaging.